Thank you, everybody. And thank you to the panelists for joining me today. Very excited about this one. Not every day we get the chance to talk about such a strong exit in the space, and thrilled to have the executive team as well as the financial advisor on the deal here to speak to it. I'll have the panelists introduce themselves as we get going here, but first, Per, I'll go over to you to just tell us a little bit about Pallet, the technology, and the problem that you were solving.
Sure. So my name is Per Langoe. I was the Chief Executive Officer for Pallet. I was also one of the co-founders for the company. So Pallet was all about improving quality of life for men, children, and women that suffer from certain diseases. And we did that through the commercialization of minimal invasive treatment options. And as you heard during the introduction, Barrigel was one of them, which was also one of the key reasons why we were acquired by Teleflex.
Fantastic. So bring us up to speed, James, on the journey that led up to this exit first. Talk about some of the equity and debt financing history and introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm James Leech. I was the Chief Business Officer at Pallet, part of the founding team with Per. We had a pretty non-traditional start at Pallet. We plugged the license rights that we had acquired into basically a royalty shell of an investment firm that was going to back us from the outset. That was a large Swedish pension fund. In the early days, it was actually pretty tough for us to raise capital. We had a lot of risks on the table, right? We had clinical and regulatory risk, we had commercial risk, and we had some IP risk as well. Ultimately, we did a $30 million equity raise in 2020 from a pretty non-traditional set of investors, mostly Nordic-based. The anchor in that round was a large Swedish family office. And that propelled us well through our clearance of Barrigel, which, as Per mentioned, was our real growth catalyst for the business. We also did some debt financing. So we had a facility with Silicon Valley Bank that was around $25 million. And then we did a refinancing and an upsizing of that facility for $50 million with OrbiMed in March of last year. It was at that point that we were also considering raising substantial additional equity to take the business to the next level commercially and from a revenue standpoint. And that was when things started to catalyze on the exit front as well.
And we'll get into kind of that inflection point and decision-making process on the financing side. Neil, I want to go over to you to introduce yourself as well and talk a little bit about the process that a company goes through and that you go through in identifying and partnering with the right financial advisor.
Sure. Thanks, Henry, and thanks for having me. I'm Neil Oberoi. I'm a medical device banker with Guggenheim Securities. I spend all my time on medical device M&A. I've been doing it now for over 20 years. Part of our job as bankers and as advisors is building relationships with folks like yourselves, companies at all stages of development, getting to know companies early, building a trusted advisor relationship, if and when there's a time to transact, or if and when there's strategic dialogue and you need our formal advice, we tend to get involved, and we compete in a highly competitive business with other firms and other bankers. In some cases, like this one, we get lucky. So we didn't have a dialogue with Pallet before we were introduced to them by one of their board members. They had a relationship with a dialogue with one of our competitors, and situation unfolded where we had a situation where we started a dialogue, and we developed that relationship, and we had that relationship for probably 18 months prior to the transaction actually unfolding. So it's hard to predict how these things will unfold, but our job as bankers and as advisors is trying to build a trusted advisor relationship with folks like yourselves, entrepreneurs, management teams, boards, to have the opportunity to work with folks like yourselves in situations like this.
James, when we spoke before the panel about the process of engaging that financial advisory, you mentioned, and you can hear it from what Neil was saying about kind of that a-traditional way of forming the relationship. You mentioned relatively, early on in your journey, did you engage Guggenheim? Talk a little bit about that kind of from the broader context, how you engage them versus maybe when other companies would engage them and run a process like that.
Yeah, sure. I think we were probably a bit early compared to other companies in terms of the timing of Guggenheim's involvement in Pallet. It was pretty clear to us that there was a decent amount of strategic interest in the business, and we were very focused on not distracting management and the company from what we were building. We had products and therapeutic areas that were relevant to a number of companies, and so we engaged Guggenheim early to kind of help serve as a buffer when we were in dialogue with strategics, and we were very clear with folks that we weren't running a process, right? But we had them on standby, so to speak, in the case or in the instance where someone wanted to be preemptive and engage. And so they were involved with us for probably 18 to 24 months prior to the actual exit. We would meet very often to talk about financial considerations for the business, how we think about exit, dialogue that's been ongoing with strategics, and of course Guggenheim would add value in that regard throughout the process. But they really dove in significantly when things started to catalyze with Teleflex.
And I think for a company of our size, when you get into a deal discussion with a blue chip company, you need to have the support of an individual like Neil and his team. It's really hard to go through diligence in a speedy fashion without their support. I think that in our case, the coaching that Neil provided, I think that was instrumental for the ultimate success. It comes obviously that there's a fee involved, but I mean, based on the work that we did with them, the value they provide is just so much more than the cost of getting the support like that.
Yeah. The value isn't free. It obviously comes with a fee, like you said. So let's talk about kind of fast forward now. You're capitalized. You talk about the debt facility, the equity financing you've done to date. How does the relationship with Teleflex get started? And we'll go back to Per to start.
Yeah, so I think James touched upon it, and I think it's critical for any medical device company that you don't wake up one day and all of a sudden there is a transaction on the table. We started entertaining relationships with different strategic partners already back in 2018, and it kind of accelerated during the journey. We probably had around 10 strategic relationships that we kept up to date. Initially, maybe once every 6 months, and once we got commercial, it was probably once every quarter. So we have a lot of potential buyers that know us really well, which means that once there is a process in place or there is an offer, we can easily get some competition going. So this is something that you have to start preparing for quite early on, and that's probably also why we engaged Neil and his team earlier than what you usually do, because Neil can have a different kind of discussion with strategic partners than what we can as a company, and it's just been very helpful to us.
I was going to say, can you say more about that, Neil, that different kind of discussion that you can have?
Yeah, so I think, oftentimes, maybe venture-backed or early-stage companies, they don't always get the balance correct, and there's no perfect science to it. It's a little more art than science of managing the strategic discussions. And I think what Per and James did really well was they focused on running the business. And there was, as Per said, a lot of strategic interest from a number of companies in Palette for obvious reasons. But they spent their time focusing on commercial launch of Barrigel, focusing on the business, and appropriately managing and balancing the information sharing and strategic interactions. And I think a lot of that drove more interest in the company broadly from a number of companies. And you don't often see that from management teams, and it's a very important part of why you might bounce things off of an advisor, whether it's a legal advisor or a financial advisor, and how to appropriately, what do I share? How do I respond to certain inbounds? Do I respond at all? Do I see them at this conference? I just saw them. Do I give them another update? A lot of those things, I think people don't always get right. And again, it's more so an art than it is a science, but I think it's what Per and James and the whole team at Palette and their board did exceptionally well, which I think is what led to a lot of the strong interest overall in the business.
So, James, if we go to that same state, kind of around when you're starting to engage strategics, these opportunities begin materializing. You're commercial, and you're likely kind of staring down the barrel of these types of exit pathways versus a potential larger financing with the company. Kind of talk about the decision making at that inflection point, what's going through leadership's mind, and how you make the decision ultimately to pursue a strategic exit versus a larger financing.
Sure. I think it's important to start with just kind of the capital intensity of our business. To put things in context, we had a shareholder base after our 2020 financing that was I would say, pretty spoiled in terms of not having experienced any dilution versus the significant growth that we had driven. And because of that, they were very dilution sensitive. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I think everyone has to protect their interests. But Pallet was in an interesting situation where we were constantly finding ways to fund the company in a non-dilutive fashion. Just to give an example of that, our clearance for Barrigel took longer than we expected in 2021 and then into 2022, and we had hired a full urology focused sales team that was, just waiting to launch the product. And so we actually struck a co-promote deal with a company called Lantheus Pharma that had an imaging agent for prostate cancer that allowed us to get into physician offices early, talk about another product, and also book revenue that was very non-dilutive for us. And I raised that just as an example of kind of the journey we would go through in creatively financing the company, even if it wasn't from traditional equity sources. It was really interesting when we reached a critical scale with Barrigel from a revenue profile standpoint. All of a sudden, we had interest from all the financial sponsors who didn't want to take the risk on us 3 years prior, which is not atypical. But the market had also really started to shift from a financial standpoint, a valuation standpoint. And so we were running into dialogues with folks where they were all doing the same math, reverse engineering into the return that they wanted based on conservative exit multiples in the future. And ultimately, when you're looking at a potential $50 or $60 million equity financing, even if you're at a strong revenue profile, if the expectations of the financial sponsor are half of yours from an exit multiple standpoint, you're going to run into some valuation challenges and potential dilution challenges. So that was really important for us when we were considering the timing of an exit. The context of when things started to catalyze with Teleflex, I think, lined up well with those discussions and gave us the optionality and the informed perspective to make a decision on optimal timing to exit the business.
And so when this process gets going in earnest, as Neil was saying, you and Per are running the business and you're focused on this. Per, I want to kind of go over to you, and from the leadership perspective, what kinds of things are you doing or strategic or operational initiatives are you thinking about to prepare the business for exit in this context?
Yeah, so that's something that starts very early. I think the best way to have a successful business is to build a business that can be a standalone business forever. I mean, you build the business from ground up. You build it to be resilient and to make sure that you can create something great from it without an M&A event necessarily, because they may or they may not happen. I think there are some things that are really important to button up quickly. You need to have a solid supply chain. That's one of the first things that a blue chip company will look at. The second one is compliance. Once you go commercial, make sure that you have compliance manuals, that people are trained, that you have a record of pretty much everything that's happened, and that's independent on whether this is an M&A event or whether it's a debt financing. So when we did our debt financing with Oberoi, we had to spend almost a full day running through our compliance, and they had a specialized lawyer looking at our compliance programs, making sure that everything had been done by the book and there were no deviations. I mean, you can have 1 or 2 deviations, and that's going to screw up the entire event for you. So I think that's critical. So I think those are probably the most important considerations to be successful long term. I think it's also important that you truly know your business. I mean, you need to know it inside out. There's going to be a lot of detailed questions, and these buyers, they will see through any illusion very quickly. So it's important to, know each and every customer that you have, because that's going to be important during diligence.
Thank you. So when we move into the process of Teleflex catalyzing, the negotiation process begins, and as you mentioned, it's an in-depth, arduous process. Neil, I want to go over to you first and to talk a little bit about the process of shaping the deal itself. What kinds of things were particularly important that you were thinking about, and what aspects of the negotiation process can the audience learn from in thinking about potentially exiting their own business?
Sure. So maybe I might speak a little more generally on M&A versus maybe the Teleflex Pallet situation, just given not a lot of that is public. But as you think about, and the criteria are different for pre-revenue businesses than they are for obviously commercial businesses. But what are some of the most critical things that when you're negotiating a transaction, obviously price, structure, deal certainty, and just some of the details in your merger agreement. So what do I mean by that? Obviously, price and structure are people read about and see the sticker price in a transaction, but you want to make sure you see all of those dollars, the dollars that close, and if there's earnouts, the earnouts. And the dollars that close, there are different parts of your merger agreement, whether it's working capital or indemnification, that will impact the dollars you'll see at close. So that's important that you're thinking about some of these things versus just price and structure. And then there are things like deal certainty. And in this environment, people talk about the FTC environment a lot and making sure that the deal closes and making sure your counterparty is signing up for whatever you think is critical for them to do to get the deal closed. So purchase price, structure, there's earnouts in my transaction. Are the earnouts structured market, and those are markets different for revenue-based earnouts or clinical-based earnouts or regulatory-based earnouts? And then what efforts is the buyer signing up for to achieve the earnouts in a particular transaction? Thinking about these things and having to make sure you have good legal counsel to help you structure and negotiate some of these things in the merger document, as well as good advisors to help you think about more than just the price, making sure you're seeing all of those dollars and making sure your deal is getting closed, are critical. And then from a buyer perspective, it's pretty similar. So these negotiations, the transaction is announced, but there's probably anywhere from 30 to 60 days of negotiations once you've agreed on a price and a structure to making sure that some of these other aspects of your contract or your deal are buttoned up before it sees the light of day in a press release.
When you're kind of speaking about the broader market, I want to maybe follow that thread for a moment. And James, we could start with you, but would love to hear some additional perspective as well. Thinking about when this deal got done versus where we are today, how would you characterize the impact of market timing and the conditions then on what ended up happening in this context versus where we are now, and if it was happening, a similar thing was happening in today's market conditions?
Yeah, I think there are probably more, but two considerations that come to mind for me when it comes to pricing and multiples. One is the broader macro environment and within the actual sub-industry that you are focused on, because of course any acquirer is going to look to historical transactions and where the markets are to inform their pricing. But the second is, of course, what you can mean to them intrinsically. And what I would focus on is the fact that you think about interventional urology as a segment that a number of strategics are pursuing and looking for growth within. I think regardless of the timing, whether it was this year or last year, the outcome would have been similar. We had a product portfolio that was just attractive to acquirers, and we had impressive growth on the revenue side. We had the ability to continue building the business if that was something we chose to do. So I think it's really important to build the business standalone and continue to focus on updating acquirers, as Per had mentioned, but ultimately what drives value is the metrics that you generate within the business. Obviously, the broader market can have some impact on that, but you need to have the fundamentals within the business.
Per, any perspective kind of from this experience to offer to people now that are going to be working in a similar concept, but in a different macroeconomic condition? It can be for either of you.
I mean, I'll give my perspective, just a little bit of maybe on the market broadly speaking, and just in M&A, specifically in med device. I mean, the last year, just to quantify it for everybody, there was probably $15 or so billion of M&A volume in med device. Prior to COVID, we would see anywhere from $20 to $30 billion, $25, $30 billion. So last year, on a relative basis, was lighter in terms of Medtech M&A. Probably not a surprise to anybody in the room. It tended to pick up in the back half of the year last year, which I guess you could argue Palette was announced in the back half of the year. And we started to see higher multiple transactions on a revenue multiple basis, and we also started to see some earlier stage transactions. I think there were 3 pre-revenue deals in November alone. So I think there was a lot of optimism coming into 2024 on the M&A side. The data hasn't really played out to support that. There's been 2 transactions of any real size so far this year. But we still feel that the tailwinds that we felt good about coming into 2024 are still there on the M&A side. Buyers have strong balance sheets. Buyers are saying the right things publicly. M&A has worked. M&A has driven top-line growth, and top-line growth has driven premium PE multiples in the sector. So I don't know that the market has changed yet on the M&A side. We feel so very good about it. But if you look at just the pure data set of what's public so far, it doesn't support it, but there's a lot of the year that's going to play out. And we're aware of things that are taking place in the sector. We're working on things in the sector. So it continues to be busy on the M&A side. We'd like the equity or the IPO side to help that out a little bit. It's anyone's guess when that thaws. But at least on just pure device M&A, it's still a pretty positive dynamic in the sector.
Great. When you look back at the entirety of the process of building the company, the strategic exit, the integration, all the things that kind of ensued from there, Per, as CEO, what kind of final learnings or considerations would you share for people thinking about building their business to that point today, or people that might be kind of in the midst of that?
So I think it's very easy to get stuck on technology and the product. It's so easy to talk about, but from a success point of view, it's really going to be about culture and people. Make sure that you have the right company culture, a culture that people strive in, that culture that people enjoy working in, and then everything else is going to work out. You can, if you have the wrong culture but the right strategy and tactics, you're not going to succeed. If you have the right culture, you can be a bit off on strategy and tactic and still win. So I think that's really important. And then what I said earlier, I think it's really important to start to prepare for some sort of an exit process early on. And it's also important to have the ability to say no, because that's your strongest card in a negotiation, to be able to say no. And that means that you need to have options. You need to either have sufficient funding or know that you can access funding, or that you have other options for the business. I think no is probably the hardest argument to work around for a strategic without actually improving the offer they have on your business. So those are the things that I would say.
I might add, I think that's what Per said is exactly right. I mean, you can't predict when a buyer or buyers are going to come want to buy your business. You might think, hey, we've achieved this clinical goals or regulatory goals, or we have such a differentiated technology, we're such a natural fit for XYZ company. You just can't predict when they're going to prioritize either your space or your company or the M&A dollars overall. So running the business, like I said earlier, balancing the strategic dialogue is very important. In this situation here, having had the dialogue with James and Per and the board for a year and a half or so before the company transacted, there was a significant inbound interest in this company. Companies wanted to meet with them, wanted to speak with them, and many times I wasn't sure if their email was working because some of those companies didn't get replies back. But that's exactly how you have to manage some of these strategic interactions sometimes, making sure you're running the business and, like I said, balancing these discussions. And that tends to in itself generate maybe a level of mystique sometimes, and people want to find out why I'm a large company, why is this company not taking every meeting I want to have with them, or sharing information every time I request it from them? Why are they pushing back? But that's in a lot of the success stories that we're involved in, it's about exactly that, and knowing when to say no, as Per said, whether it's on a negotiation or just a strategic interaction or just a desire to grab coffee at the next conference when you just saw XYZ company a month ago and there was nothing newer to share with them.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that on information sharing. I think this is where counsel from Neil and his team was really important. Shortly after we launched Barrigel, we had a lot of folks looking for an update on the business commercially, and we were tempted to engage in that. And actually, the counsel from Neil was, well, you're 1 quarter into your launch. Why would you give folks an update right now? It's unlikely to meet their expectations. It's really difficult, right, to catalyze growth that quickly when you're launching a product. So why don't we let the metrics get a bit further, let the progress take hold, and then engage with folks from a position of strength. And that type of restraint, I think, is really important to make sure that when you're providing updates on the business, you're kind of skipping periods where there may be a lull in progress or a natural tendency for the business to take time to mature. It's really important that the news you share is good news, just like with a public company, right? You look to share events that are a real catalyst for growth. And when you're private, it's the same thing. But the benefit is you can choose how and when you share that information. You're not, beholden to capital market regulations around materiality and disclosures. So I just think Neil's point on information sharing, timing of interactions is really important.
It seems like there's a very human element of this song and dance, of a bit of letting it come to you and also a bit of running the process, yourself outbound. Anything else to kind of add to that? I know we're talking a lot about the information you share, the technical, the financial, but some of the things that you talked about is, the urge to reach out to that person at the next conference, to set up that next meeting, to be hyper responsive to all of the messaging that may be inbound and that, you may be delivering. How do you kind of counsel from the interpersonal perspective, how you manage that relationship building process from, what you do outbound versus what you take inbound, and how frequently you're communicating as people?
It's interesting because certain companies will have certain level of dialogue with their obvious counterparties. Sometimes there'll be companies that they hadn't thought about, or they don't have the conversations with, or the dialogue, or the right level of dialogue within certain organizations. So oftentimes, when we're partnering with the company, either informally or formally, we'll find out where has your conversation been, with whom in each organization, and how often, and what's been the depth of that, and do you need to elevate it in a certain organization, and how can we help with that, or do you need to involve other companies that you haven't had a conversation yet, and how do you do that, and when do you do that, and what's the message to them that you're trying to bring in that introduction? So if and when there's a time where you're going to run maybe a broad process. By the way, not every exit needs to be a broad process. Sometimes these exits are bilateral. Sometimes they're 2 or 3 companies. Sometimes you do go broad, not much broader than that in med device. It all just depends on every situation is different. But you at least want to have an informed view of the landscape before you make a decision on how you're going to pursue your path, and just making sure you've checked the boxes appropriately, and with the right individuals at these organizations will help you best inform the path forward.
And I think for us, it was very useful to work with Neil from that perspective as well, because if you talk to 5, 10 different companies, we don't know who the ultimate decision maker is. It's going to be the board and the CEO at some point, but who are the people that we need to convince and communicate with along the way? It's just not only the one individual or the few individuals that we have initial contact with, but what's the decision process, and what are the hang-ups that they usually have, and hurdles. And Neil's coaching was phenomenal from that perspective.
Awesome. As we kind of wrap up our time here, I want to end with a couple things. One, Neil, you kind of opened this box a moment ago, but broader M&A outlook for 2024 and beyond a little bit. Put this in the broader context of the medtech space. Obviously, an extremely attractive product portfolio in this case, and large strategic interest. But what do you see as the M&A outlook going into this year, and what would you kind of leave our audience with, thinking about the broader state of M&A?
We still feel good about M&A in med device. As I said earlier, some of the things that we look at, what are med device buyers of all sizes telling us? What are they telling the street publicly? It's not always the same. What's their level of interaction with folks like Per and James at their companies? And what are we seeing in terms of LOIs being submitted, and dialogue that's taken place, and things that we're actually working on, things that we're asked to maybe pitch for, or not necessarily winning in certain situations that we're aware of. So there's a lot of activities. There's a lot of M&A dialogue and activity taking place. Last year and this year so far, it tends to be a little bit more focused on commercial stage businesses. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean $50+ million in revenue, but there's been less focus on taking on regulatory, clinical risk, and ultimately EPS dilution. It's not to say there's been no appetite for that, and that's not a surprise given just where rates have been and given how M&A is cyclical. That being said, as I said last year, we saw 4 pre-revenue deals, 3 in November alone. And M&A and medtech buyers, there's always a dumbbell approach. We need the pre-revenue pipeline opportunities, and we need the commercial stage opportunities to help drive our top line, but also in certain environments like this one, we need to make sure we're managing EPS appropriately. So it would be extremely helpful if there was an active IPO market to help the M&A dialogue, and anyone's guess when that comes back. It's always cyclical again. We've seen this movie before. It will come back. But from our perspective, we expect a busy year in med device M&A. It's hard to predict where it all ultimately ends up, but it feels good. I wish I'd seen more data points. Hit the tape already this year.
Great. Well, I want to make sure we also leave some time to talk about what you guys are working on now. Per, why don't we start over you? Tell us a little bit about what you're working on now and how some of this experience is feeding that.
Yeah, sure. So I was recently appointed to CEO for GT Medical Technologies. It's a company that is primarily owned by MVM Capital and Gilda. Phenomenal company, mission-driven company. So we improve quality of life of people that suffer from brain tumors. We have a device that can be used to control tumor regrowth in patients that have had a resection of a bigger tumor in the brain. So early clinical results are phenomenal, significantly better than standard of care. And the journey that we have ahead of us is to continue to improve execution, making sure that there is more clinical data available, and ultimately get into the standards and guidelines and become the true standard of care for these patients that suffer tremendously from this horrible disease.
James, over to you.
Sure. I recently took a job as Chief Financial and Strategy Officer at a company called Maximed. We have a commercial stage product for knee osteoarthritis. So we have an implantable shock absorber that acts as a bridge for patients who have failed conservative therapies like injections or weight loss, but are not candidates or are not ready yet for a knee replacement. So a very large market, a space that hasn't seen innovation in over 30 years. We have some similar shareholders to GT. So Gilda is in our company, also NEA, Advent, and a deep history with Morgan Thaler and Vertex Ventures as well. And we're currently raising a Series D financing. So if that sounds interesting, feel free to connect with me after this.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit more? Again, when we had talked early about this deal with Palette, you had talked about looking at that larger financing, looking at the opportunity to sell, raising a Series D now. How are you thinking about that, with the experience of having kind of stared down that barrel before?
I think you just need to know what you're signing up for. At a certain point, the capital into the company is a determinant of what you are expecting to get out of the company, and that's the math that investors do. And of course, that's assuming you're in a successful scenario where you're continuing to drive growth on the revenue side and drive value that acquirers are willing to pay for. So it's the same math we did at Palette, which was, okay, if we don't sell now and we take this money, what do we need to sell for later to get the same value for existing shareholders that we would get today if we sold today? So those same dialogues and thought processes happen within boards and within companies, and it's no different at Maximed as we raise a Series D. When you look at the ortho industry, I think from our perspective, it's clear that we need to show revenue traction, especially given we've launched a disruptive device. We're building a new market, and we have some reimbursement opportunities ahead of us as well. So it's always important to think about how a deal drives the eventual needs from a capital return standpoint later on. But ultimately, if you need money, you need money, and you have to move forward, right?
Absolutely.
And I think it's, when you look at medical device companies, startup companies, smaller companies, I think it's just hard to do a transaction north of $1 billion because the buyer universe just decreases. So that tells you that if you look at the normal returns that shareholders are looking for, you can calculate how much money you can raise, and that's going to dictate what kind of execution that you can have for the business. So important to keep that in mind when you do your long-range business planning.
Great. As we wind down and give folks the opportunity to come up after the panel and talk to you guys, ask some questions, want to just go down the line. Per, we'll start with you. Just final thoughts on the entire process, the journey with Palette, and things you want to leave the audience with. Yeah,
so I think it was phenomenally rewarding. I mean, we were thinking about the exit, but we weren't. So we were all about execution and working together as a team. I don't think that we had one single day, maybe one or two, but very few days where it actually felt that you left home and went to work, because it was just such an exciting journey. And again, the one thing I would highlight is the company culture and the people. Make sure that you hire the right people and you have the right company culture. If you do, most things are going to work out.
I mean, we were thrilled to work with Per, James, and a very experienced team across the board, and we got to witness the culture that Per's mentioned a couple times firsthand, and the camaraderie amongst his team throughout the transaction, closing dinner, et cetera. So I can't, having worked with a number of companies in M&A over how many years, having that right team around you, because not only for just building your business, but when a buyer comes, who do they interact with, and what's the reflection of the business? It's the people that they're talking to, the people that are facilitating the due diligence, and they're exciting them about the opportunity even more. So I would echo everything Per has said so far, and continue to make sure you are building your business and not trying to time your exit.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. Obviously, an exit is what most folks strive for, and that's fun and it's great. But when you look back, it's actually the company building process that was the most fun and where you had the fondest memories. So what I would say, having been through the journey now and come out the other side, and this is something that I'm definitely taking forward into other businesses now, Maximed, is to just enjoy the process, enjoy the challenges, have fun every day. Per mentioned Pallet almost never felt like work. And most of the management team and just general team at Pallet continues to be lifelong friends because of the bonds that we formed during the period where we were running the business.
Great. Well, we'll wrap up there so that way folks can come up and ask questions to you guys. Thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing that insight on the Pallet and the company building journey, the deal process, and looking forward to the success with your next ventures and your next set of deals.
Thanks, Henry.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.